Here come the lights. You don't have to stand here. People have presented from the table.
No, we were just going back and forth. I think I prefer standing,
Okay.
but who knows, maybe halfway through I'll come over here. But thank you very much.
Yep. I'll be up here the whole time. So.
There's one more session after ours.
Two. Yeah. Sergeant Arms, are we good? Yes, sir. Everybody's. All right, we're going to go ahead and get back into it. Thank you again for Medico for sponsoring our lunch today. Please make sure also to get your name tag scanned so you can get credit for the pick form that will be filled out after the completion of the conference. Our next session is on the Hatch Act for sheriffs, and I'd like to introduce Ms. Anna Galinda Marone, the chief of the Hatch Act Unit, Office of Special Counsel, and Kelly Resendez from the same office.
Good afternoon. I want to begin by thanking the Virginia Sheriff's Association for inviting me back. It's always a pleasure to come and join you at this conference. It looks like I'm on a 2-year cycle with you all. And your sessions tend to be one of the more memorable ones that I do. A lot of questions, a lot of interest. And at the Office of Special Counsel, we really appreciate the engagement that you all have had with us over the years. Based on the fact that our hotline has been receiving a lot of calls from sheriff's offices this year, in particular from Virginia, I thought I'd introduce Kelly Resendez, who's one of our senior attorneys and one of 2 attorneys in my unit responsible for handling the calls. So I'm sure that some of you have probably spoken to her or have been working with her on advisory opinions. So this afternoon, there's a lot to cover. I wanted to establish a bit of a roadmap, and I want to ensure everyone that we've built in time for questions. I encourage questions throughout. We're going to be pausing. Okay. Hopefully everybody could hear me. Now I feel like it's very loud. I'm going to be pausing, or Kelly, throughout the presentation to welcome questions. But if you see that you have a pressing question and we're moving on and we're not taking a break, just raise your hand and we'll take the question at that point. In terms of the next hour, we're going to very quickly do some background information on our agency and what we do with state and local employees in terms of the Hatch Act. Then we're going to move into permitted activities. A lot of times we spend so much time talking about what's prohibited that at the end of the presentation, people will be asking me some very basic questions about what's permitted. So we decided we would cover some of that on the front end. Then we're going to go into some detail about coverage. In 2012, Congress amended the law, and it created some confusion in terms of how the Hatch Act applies. It doesn't apply the same to everyone, and the standards are different. So hopefully we can unpack that during the presentation. And then we're going to spend a good amount of time talking about the 3 key prohibitions, providing examples, and hopefully answering all your questions. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Kelly, who's going to take the first part of the presentation.
Thank you, Anna. It's very nice to be here. Thank you so much for having us. As Anna mentioned, I do work the Hatch Act hotline, so I may have spoken with many of you, so it's an honor to be here. Switch slides. So the Hatch Act was enacted in 1939, and as Anna mentioned, it does apply to state and local employees. That happened a year later. And in 2012, the law was amended by Congress to narrow the scope of employees who are covered by the Hatch Act's candidacy prohibition. So that's just a little bit of background about the law. Our agency, the Office of Special Counsel, we're a federal executive branch agency, and we have an important role in Hatch Act enforcement. As Anna mentioned, we provide advice to employees and also to members of the public who have questions about the law. We have a Hatch Act hotline that people call. We have an inbox that receives emails, and we frequently receive requests for formal advisory opinions from employees. Maybe right before they want to run for office, they'll ask whether the Hatch Act applies to them, and also what prohibitions apply to them so that they know whether they can use, for example, pictures of themselves in uniform for campaign purposes. So those are some frequent questions we get, and so we'll actually analyze the person's position and whether or not they're subject to those prohibitions, and answer the questions about what they can do when it comes to use of official title, uniform for campaign purposes under the Hatch Act. We also have an important role investigating complaints of alleged Hatch Act violations. So anyone can file a complaint with our office. And generally, when it comes to state and local employees, we first need to find out whether or not they're covered. We'll talk about coverage in more detail. But then we'll investigate the complaint, find out whether the allegations have some merit. And if we find that there is a violation that warrants disciplinary action, we're also tasked with pursuing discipline before the Merit Systems Protection Board, which we'll talk about a little bit more as well. Anna mentioned that we want to go through some permitted activities. So before we talk about the prohibitions, here are some of those examples. I want to make sure that all employees understand that regardless of whether you're covered by the Hatch Act or not, you're able to attend and be active at political rallies and meetings. You can join and be active in political parties and clubs, including holding office in those parties. You can circulate nominating petitions, and you can campaign for or against referendum questions, constitutional amendments, and municipal ordinances. In addition, employees can campaign for or against candidates running in partisan elections. You can make campaign speeches for candidates in partisan elections, distribute campaign literature, as well as be candidates for public office in nonpartisan elections. And we'll continue to use the term partisan election pretty frequently. An election is partisan if any candidate in the election is running with political party affiliation, such as Republican or Democrat. So even if the employee is running as an independent, if in that election other candidates are running with political party affiliation, it's still going to be considered a partisan election for purposes of the Hatch Act. So that's important to know and something to understand as we get into the prohibitions. Are there any questions about permitted activities before we start talking about the prohibitions? Okay. So the Hatch Act, there are 3 main prohibitions that could apply to state and local employees. I'm going to go through them briefly here, and then we'll go through each in turn. The first 2 prohibitions on the slide apply to employees who have job duties in connection with federally funded programs and activities. And those employees who fit that category are unable to use their official authority or influence for the purpose of interfering with or affecting the result of an election, and they may not directly or indirectly coerce or attempt to coerce another employee to engage in political activity or contribute anything of value to a party, a campaign, or anything for political purposes. And that only applies to employees who have job duties in connection with federally funded activities, which we'll talk about more. The prohibition I'm going to talk about in more detail right now is this last prohibition, which is that employees whose salaries are entirely federally funded may not be candidates for public office and partisan elections. So what that means is that if your salary is 100% federally funded, you may not be a candidate in an election if the election is partisan. And again, partisan meaning that there are candidates in that election running with political party affiliation. And as we go into these prohibitions, it's important to know that the Hatch Act continues to apply to individuals. Even while they're on annual leave, sick leave, leave without pay, administrative leave, it's still going to continue to apply. And we have gotten questions from part-time or seasonal employees, and the Hatch Act does still apply to those employees as well. A question that I get on the hotline pretty regularly is if the agency receives no federal funding at all, whether employees could still be covered by the Hatch Act, and the answer is no. So if your agency doesn't receive any federal funding at all, your employees of that agency are not going to be covered by the Hatch Act. But what's also important to know is that when we're looking at federal funding, we're looking at where the funding originates. So even though the federal funding may be coming through the county, maybe it's a pass-through grant, if it originates at the federal level, it's going to be considered federal funding for purposes of the Hatch Act. So if you think that there's no federal funding at your agency, it's still important to understand where that funding is coming from to make sure it's not originating at the federal level. Let's talk about candidacy a little bit more. As I just mentioned, this prohibition is going to apply to employees whose salaries are 100% federally funded. So for example, if your salary is 90%, 95% federally funded, this prohibition is not going to apply to you. It needs to be entirely federally funded. And as I mentioned, an election is partisan if any candidate is running with political party affiliation. Now, this prohibition does not apply to elections for party office. There's a differing definition for party office versus public office. So for example, if you wanted to run for precinct chairperson and your salary is 100% federally funded, you could still do that. The Hatch Act's not going to prohibit you from doing that. In addition, it's also important to know that when we talk about elections during this presentation, not just this prohibition, we're talking about elections at all levels. So from city council to sheriff to president to Congress, all of that's going to be covered by these prohibitions. Now, there is an exception for some individuals with a candidacy prohibition. It doesn't apply to all employees, and specifically, the Hatch Act carves out these specific employees from the candidacy prohibition. So even if these employees have salaries that are entirely federally funded, they're not going to be subject to the prohibition, so they could still run for office. And really, that's because these individuals hold an inherently political position. And so Anna will talk a little bit more about the exemption and how it applies elsewhere in the Hatch Act. But specifically, if you are a governor of a state, mayor, or an individual holding elective office, the Hatch Act's candidacy prohibition is not going to apply to you. Now, this position that I just mentioned, these four options here, they must be the individual's principal employment. So if somebody holds a full-time position elsewhere and they have this elected position that's not their principal employment, this exemption is not going to apply. And even though they're exempted from this candidacy prohibition, it doesn't mean that the other Hatch Act prohibitions do not apply to them. So we'll talk more about that as well, and I'm going to welcome Anna back up to talk about those two remaining prohibitions.
Just to add a couple of points here. So sheriff, to be clear, if you're an elected sheriff, you would fall under the exemption, as well as if you're acting in that position. If there's been a vacancy, and for example, I'm not sure if in Virginia the governor gets to appoint during the interim an acting sheriff, because you're considered holding an elective office, you would also fall under the exemption. So I just wanted to make that point. The other thing is we talked about if you're part-time, you're still covered by the Hatch Act, but that's only if that part-time position is your principal employment. Because we've had situations where someone works in a sheriff's office, maybe they're a deputy, and they work part-time in that position, but they have a full-time job elsewhere. Then the Hatch Act would not apply because it's not their principal employment. So I just wanted to make that point. So where we get the majority, we used to get a lot of questions about candidacy, but because it became easier for state and local employees to run when the law was changed, because now it's hard to find people that are 100% federally funded. So really we receive very little when it comes to candidacy for state and local employees, very few complaints on that. Where we get a lot of complaints, some legitimate and some just a complete misunderstanding of what the law prohibits, is with the next two prohibitions that we're going to discuss. And so the majority of our cases at the Office of Special Counsel that we investigate concern these two prohibitions. The first, the important thing here is, as Kelly said, if your office receives federal funds, then anyone in the office that has duties in connection with any activity that is federally funded will be subject to these two prohibitions. And that would also include, for example, the sheriff. So although the sheriff is exempt from the candidacy prohibition, would not be exempt from these two prohibitions. The first is that a covered employee cannot use their official authority or influence to interfere with an election. And the second is that directly or indirectly coercing, attempting to coerce, advise, you can pretty much put any verb you want in there, but basically having other state and local employees, in particular subordinates, perform political chores or make political contributions would be prohibited. And we'll get into more detail about this. So the first thing I want to break down is job duties in connection with. What does that really mean? And so the first question is, so when we get a request to determine if someone is covered for purposes of these two prohibitions, first question we ask, A, does the agency receive federal funds? The answer is yes. Then we want to know if the individual at issue has any duties in connection with any of the federal money that the agency is receiving. And it can be administrative duties, it can be operational duties, it can be supervisory duties, any type of duty, okay? Almost inevitably, the higher up you are in the chain of command, the more likelihood that you are going to have supervisory duties in connection with the federally funded programs. And usually the person at the very top is considered connected to all the programs of the office, okay? So typically when we're looking at someone that's the head of the agency and there's federal money there, 99% of the time, the individual is going to be covered with regarding the two prohibitions, the coercion and the use of official authority, okay? Gets a little bit dicier as you go down the chain of command, and now you're a deputy, you have road patrol. It gets a little trickier trying to figure out, do you have any contact with the federal money? And it's not enough that you wear equipment purchased with federal funds, right? So if your only connection to the federal money is that you are on the receiving end of equipment that was purchased with federal funds, that's not a duty in connection with. But if you're the individual tasked with overseeing the program, right, that purchases the equipment, that has to do accounting for the equipment, that makes purchasing decisions, reporting requirements, that person has duties in connection with the money that's coming in for the equipment, but not the end user, okay? Any questions about duties in connection with? It's so fact-specific. You know, one person might be covered, another person is not. So we always look at each individual situation and try to sort out the facts. Okay, so for candidacy, as Kelly discussed, it is critical that your salary be 100% federally funded. For duties in connection with, it's not a requirement, right? So you may not have 1 penny of your salary paid with federal funds, but if you have duties in connection with a program that receives federal money, then you're going to be subject to the Hatch Act, not for candidacy, but for the use of official authority and the coercion prohibitions. The other thing is, it doesn't necessarily require that you have administrative or supervisory duties. I want to emphasize it's any duty. And any amount can trigger coverage. There is one very old case in this area that was decided under the Civil Service Commission, which is a predecessor agency that used to enforce the Hatch Act. And the only time they found that the amount was too small was in a case where it was less than 0.1% of the duties the individual had were in connection with this federal money that was coming in. It was so de minimis that it's the only time that it's been found to not be enough, okay? But if it's 10%, 5%, 20%, that's going to be enough. Okay, so now we're going to talk about these two prohibitions. And I call it for short, coercing other employees. No magic words. When you look at the case law in this area, no magic words are necessary when you're dealing with a subordinate. So, and even in the federal context, I'll get, supervisors that tell me, well, it was an FYI email. I was just letting them know some important facts about a candidate. That's enough to be considered coercive. So, advising staff how to vote, if you're a supervisor, advising staff on how to vote, sending them emails, like I said, even suggesting information about a candidate. If you're on social media and in particular, you tag friends that are actually subordinates from your agency, and what you're tagging them about is a campaign, a candidate, or a political party, that's enough to trigger concerns under this prohibition. So be really careful about that. Requesting that staff attend political event. If you have subordinates, you should never request that a subordinate attend a political event. Now, I know from doing this for so many years that it gets very tricky in sheriff's offices, because you have subordinates that want to volunteer to support your campaign. So there's a difference between accepting volunteers from your staff that have come forward unsolicited by you to volunteer for your campaign. That's allowed. But approaching the staff to support your campaign is a problem under the Hatch Act. It has to be unsolicited volunteers coming forward and wanting to endorse you, wanting to go and knock on doors, wanting to walk in a neighborhood and distribute campaign material. It has to be voluntary. We've had cases where staff, there were shakedowns, thankfully not in Virginia. I'm a resident of Virginia, and I'm proud to say that I've never gotten a complaint in Virginia about this, but we've had cases involving police departments and sheriff's offices where staff was expected on payroll day, the allegations that people had to line up and go to one of the captains that was taking information on how much money the staff was going to be contributing to the boss's campaign. Real serious violations of the Hatch Act. Let's see, political chores and political events. So we often get complaints about deputies photographed using their vehicles to distribute campaign signs in a neighborhood, okay? We get complaints about members of a sheriff's office or a police department that are in a letter, an endorsement letter. 30, 40 people from the office have signed a letter showing their support or their endorsement for the candidate. That can sometimes be a problem, because if the staff felt that they were obligated to sign that endorsement letter, then that potentially, again, triggers a violation of the Hatch Act if the person doing the asking is covered, right? This always goes back to coverage. If you're covered, then you can't go around, if you're a deputy, a captain, and you want to approach other employees, you're excited, maybe you want to help reelect the sheriff, and you're trying to get others on the staff to support, be very careful. Because if you're in a supervisory position or in a position of authority over these other folks, it would be considered coercive under the Hatch Act. So concerns there. Another issue that comes up is folks from the office in campaign photographs. So we'll get a complaint, and it's unclear whether these individuals were voluntarily in the photograph or whether they were required to be in the photograph. So those are the kinds of inquiries we at OSC have to engage in when we get one of these complaints. And we'll talk about it a little bit more with the next prohibition, but the other complicating factor is the use of uniform, because often the deputies, the captains, the sergeants, the folks in the photograph showing support for the candidate, they're in uniform, and they can't be in uniform. It's political activity. The only person allowed to be in uniform is the elected official, the sheriff. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute as well. Any questions about this? You guys are particularly quiet today. Maybe it's the end of the conference or you're afraid to ask questions, but we've been getting a lot of questions on the hotline. So don't be shy, okay? Let's see. So use of official authority. And these two go hand in hand because typically, if you've violated the coercion one, then it's probably because you're in a position of authority, so it's also a use of your official authority. So those two usually go hand in hand. But here, so all the examples I talked about in the preceding slide are also violations of the use of official authority. But in addition to that, you also have the use of agency resources. And what I mean by that is the actual office. We have gotten complaints of offices, whether it's a police department or it's a sheriff's office, that's being used for campaign purposes. It's almost acting as the de facto campaign headquarters. People are coming in from the street and dropping off contributions. There's campaign material in the lobby. So you have to be careful with that. The office, it's a government office, needs to remain nonpartisan, okay? So that's the office. Now we see more and more allegations involving agency websites and agency social media accounts. We've had a number of complaints come in recently where the sheriff is running for re-election and they use the agency website or agency social media account to announce it. There has to be a separation between the official function and resources of the office and the campaign. So we always advise that when time comes for an announcement, a re-election, use the campaign accounts. Don't use the office accounts, okay? It gets a little bit murky when we have someone that uses their personal account for both official and campaign purposes. That gets a little bit, we've even had a number of high-profile cases involving federal political appointees where that's happened. Same problem at the state and local level. The best practice, that you keep it separate. If you have a personal account, decide what you want to use it for. If it's going to be for campaign purposes, then that's what it should be. And if you want to use it for official purposes, then don't put any of the campaign stuff on it, because it begins to be very difficult to separate out when you're speaking with your official authority versus when you're a candidate, if you're blending the activities on the account. And again, I'm talking about a personal account in those instances. Use of title. Oh, let's stay on. No, I covered all the equipment. No, there's more with equipment. So we have had a number of cases, especially out west, where they use like a law enforcement vehicle, also helicopters, for auction purposes, to raise money. So they'll be, and it's for the campaign. So the sheriff is running for re-election, and one of the fundraisers, exactly, and one of the fundraisers is to auction off a ride-along, right? So now it's official, but it's being used for campaign purposes. It's either a helicopter ride or it's a vehicle ride. Clearly, I think from the reaction here, I think everyone knows that's a big no-no. But it happens, and we get complaints of that. Let's see, what else? Keeps it entertaining on my end. Been doing this for 20 years, and I'm still surprised. So, official title and uniform or official insignia. The majority of our complaints involve this area. If you're the sheriff, you may, as the elected official, you may appear in at campaign events, in campaign material, campaign photographs. You may wear your official uniform, okay, even if it's a campaign event. But that exception only applies to the elected sheriff. No one else. If it's a deputy in the office or any other individual that's running and they're covered by the Hatch Act, they cannot wear any official gear, insignia. Sometimes I see, and I think some of you may be wearing it like the polo shirts. That's still considered part of your official uniform. You cannot wear that in campaign photographs or at campaign events. I've had people that wanted to follow the rules, but then they use the insignia of the office on their campaign pages, or there's a picture of the badge. All of that is official material, and the only person that has this allowance is the elected official, okay? There's more to come. So, use of title. So, use of title, same thing. If you're the elected official, you can be introduced with your title, you can have it on your campaign website. But if you are not the elected official, I know people tell me all the time it's a disadvantage, I recognize it, but you cannot be using your official title for campaign purposes, except that, of course, you want to run on your background, your bio, what you've done. So as part of your bio, you can list all your responsibilities, your work history, and that can include your job in law enforcement, even if it's your current job and you're running, because you're allowed to, because you're not 100% federally funded, right? But you still have to remember the use of official authority prohibition if you have duties in connection with. So what I always say, and it's the same rule for federal employees, it has to be balanced. If you're going to make it part of your bio, and of course you are, you want to make sure that you've got other work history there. It's not just your current job that you're emphasizing, okay? Any questions about that? Okay. Ooh, I didn't see it. Yes. So I don't know if there'd be any other state rules or local rules governing the use of that, but from a Hatch Act perspective, that's not prohibited because it's not your current position. So that would be allowed. Let's see here. I'm just taking a quick look. Okay, so a couple of things that we've had to clarify over time. In 2018, so back in 2012, we issued the opinion explaining why elected officials have this narrow exception. In fact, I probably should have, because this is what we've been talking about. In 2012, we issued the advisory explaining this narrow exception. And by the way, it also applies to you as the elected official. Let's say one of the sheriffs in the audience, you now want to endorse someone else. That's allowed. It's not just for your own election as an elected official. It's understood that you hold a political office. You're also allowed to endorse candidates in other races, okay? But, so when we issued this opinion in 2012, and it's on our website, we then needed to issue a clarifying one in 2018, and this just recently came up, so I thought it was worth talking about. Even though the elected official, the sheriff, has this exception and can use uniform to go to campaign events and appear in campaign photographs, we are advising that it is still a use of official authority for the sheriff to go through a neighborhood, canvassing for votes and knocking on people's doors in uniform. I think that most citizens, I know that if I have a uniformed officer at the door, I'm immediately opening the door. I feel compelled to open the door. I think it's an official matter. I'm not thinking it could be a campaign visit. So as a result of that, we advise, and we have this advisory back from 2018, clarifying that you should be thinking through, even though there's this allowance, if you're going to use your uniform in a situation, and it's for campaign purposes, where citizens might feel compelled, right, to let you in or to address them because they think it's an official matter, then that's probably not a situation where you should be wearing your official uniform to campaign, okay? We recently had a case where an individual followed all the rules. They were at, on election day, they were at the polls at one of the polling sites. They were standing where they were supposed to be. It was a sheriff. The sheriff was wearing his uniform. Some of the other candidates were there as well. And several complaints were filed with our office because some of the folks that were coming in to vote felt that it was very coercive for the sheriff to approach them in uniform to hand like a sample ballot as they went in to vote. We concluded, I think we concluded that it was not so we concluded it was not a violation. But I bring that example to you because A, we felt the sheriff was doing everything correctly. It's not like he was out in the parking lot, as people got out of their cars, approaching them. He was where all the candidates were supposed to stand. But one of the things that we advised this particular sheriff is that in the future, he might have wanted to have like a little campaign table. Or some of the candidates had campaign tents. Maybe have some of your campaign volunteers with you, because then maybe it's much harder for someone from the public that's going in to vote to think that somehow it's a use of official authority, right? You're at your campaign table, so you're clearly there in your candidate capacity. So that was advice that we gave this individual to avoid, a future violation, but we did not find the individual to have violated this prohibition. The other situation that comes up quite frequently is parades. And there's all kinds of variations on this issue. So there are official parades, right? If it's an official city parade or county parade, and the sheriff's office has a tradition of participating, maybe all the government offices participate, the key here is to keep it official. If the sheriff if the parade time comes around and you've got an incumbent sheriff that's running for re-election, I think it's important to remember that it's an official event. Everyone's there in official uniform representing the office, and no campaign materials should be distributed. We've had instances around the country where at these types of official parades, campaign material was distributed. Then you have other parades. We actually see campaign parades, right? There, make sure that if there are people from the office other than the sheriff, they're not wearing uniform, because that's been the problem. They've got to be there in civilian clothing, no uniform. It's a campaign parade, okay? And make sure everyone that's there is there voluntarily. Then we've had community parades, going back to the community parades, where campaigns are also invited. So it's a mix. You've got official offices represented, you've got campaigns, you've got just a whole host of different entities participating in the parade. Where it's gotten dicey and complaints have come in is the sheriff who's running for re-election had the sheriff's office in the parade, and it's official. But right in front of the sheriff's office group is the campaign group. And the lines get blurred, because now you've got the sheriff in uniform with the volunteers handing out campaign material, but right behind the sheriff is the sheriff's office. In those instances, we advise that there should be some distance. Put a different group in between the campaign group and the sheriff's office, right? So it's clear it's two separate entities there. And that avoids, hopefully, generating a Hatch Act complaint. Kelly, do you have anything from your calls or experiences here?
Not that you haven't already discussed.
Okay.
What about,
You sure?
there's other candidates for other offices who have a pro-law enforcement platform that want to take pictures for their campaign in front of a marked car.
Okay, so yes, this happens quite a bit. So what we've said, it's tricky. It depends on the facts, right? If there's a pro-law enforcement candidate and they ask you, hey, we want to use some of the equipment in the background for a photograph, I would advise that that's a violation, okay? However, we have had a number of cases where the same candidate waits until there's a good opportunity, there's a ton of sheriff's vehicles parked outside the office, they stand across the street, they've got a good camera, they take the photograph, that's not a violation. But if the office is complicit with the candidate, then that's a problem, okay? Any other questions? Yes.
If a person knowingly makes a false statement to an officer, a trooper, or a deputy, that's a crime under Virginia law. And that person can be charged, prosecuted, and convicted. Are there any consequences if the person makes a knowingly false accusation to the Hatch Act?
That's a good question. When you make false statements to a federal entity, there are criminal provisions that apply. They're federal. So that's the short answer. Making a false statement in a federal matter is prohibited and potentially criminal. We're not part of the Department of Justice, so I hesitate to say more because, you know, we all stay in our lane in terms of discussing. I can talk until I'm blue in the face about the Hatch Act, but in terms of how the Department of Justice, their receipt of those complaints, how they're handled, whether they choose to prosecute those types of complaints, I'm unable to answer those questions. But our office, on occasion, has referred false statements in one of our investigations to the Department of Justice. But it's out of our hands. Like, we don't have any jurisdiction to do anything about it. What we can do is if we learn that someone is lying to us, right, and it's a false statement, it's a false accusation, certainly that's going to go a long way to closing the complaint. But in terms of what the Department of Justice might do with a case like that, I would be unable to address that point. Any other questions? Yes.
I've got a question as far as the parades, the county fairs, stuff like that. I keep my campaign completely separate in the parades and stuff, but when you're talking about a county fair, I have two different separate booths. I move between the booths, but in my jurisdiction, I have a company that spends millions of dollars coming after me. They're very confrontational. They come after me to where it's a issue for me. So my deputies, when I'm out at these events, sometimes my deputies have to protect me, which, I mean, I've had them, you know, come after my family. I've had them come after my deputies' family. So my question to you is, if I'm out and about in the public, campaigning, keeping the community safe, and I'm moving between the two booths, and I have a problem that my deputies have to come intervene to get these people off of me, and they snap a picture, they could easily say that I'm using my deputies to campaign. And so I think that, you know, I guess I'm asking for some clarification on that.
Sure.
Because, I mean, do you recommend that I bring deputies off duty? Or, but I mean, it's in a rural environment that I'm in, it's problematic.
No, it sounds definitely like it is, and it's a pretty unique situation that you're asking me to answer. So just my initial reaction to it is that I think you're doing the right thing. You've got two separate booths, right? You've got your campaign booth, then there's the office of the sheriff that's represented as well. You're moving in between both. If your deputies are responding because it's a genuine law enforcement matter, which it sounds like, if they're having to respond to protect you because you're feeling that you're being threatened in a way where any individual would have deputies come in and step in and aid them, then I know the picture may look like there's an issue there and that the deputies are campaigning on your behalf. But I would like to think that my staff and I, in gathering all the information, would not conclude that there was a Hatch Act issue there. Because what you're describing to me doesn't sound like a Hatch Act issue.
Okay, and the other question I have, like, we're at a parade in our official capacity, walking with our men. We're not able to use those photos of us out in the community. Are you saying we should not use that on any political?
So the official, I'm glad you brought that up. So we advise against using official photographs. So certainly, like I said, you in uniform in a campaign ad, that's fine. But taking photographs from official events and using them for campaign purposes, I would advise against.
Okay, thank you.
Question over there.
Yes.
So in that same regard, if you were to share, for instance, the city of Fredericksburg Sheriff's Office onto Sheriff Scott Foster's page, if you were to share that page, would that be an issue if it went on his campaign page?
Ooh, can you give me a little, and I am not on social media, so I may have to punt to Kelly. I choose to keep sane and not go the route of social media, so.
So we have a city of Fredericksburg page, a business page.
Okay.
I actually run the sheriff's page, Sheriff Scott Foster. So if I were to go on there and share the city of Fredericksburg's page, say we were at an event onto his actual official campaign page, would that be an issue? We're sharing it, we're not posting it on there, we're sharing our business onto it.
Well, I think if, Anna, if the position is that sheriff should not, thank you. If the position is that sheriff should not be sharing on their own accord pictures of them at official events on the campaign page, I think the same would be said for sharing information from other government agencies about events. I think the same rule would apply. Sure.
Questions? It's hard to see. Okay.
Any other question? I know the light is pretty strong, so I can't tell if there are any other hands up.
Well, we got
The social media, particularly Facebook, personal Facebook page, also have a campaign Facebook page that I rarely use, but I have 3 or 4 deputies that manage our Facebook page.
Okay.
And for the past 8 years, I have shared, last big incident I can think of is one of our SROs saved a middle schooler's life. And of course, you know, we share all of that. I share that to my personal page, and my understanding that we should not do that.
It's your personal page, which so you sound like you may have a hybrid page. You post some campaign content as well as official content?
Right, I have another page that is a political page that I don't use hardly ever. It's just there.
Yeah, so yours is one of the tricky ones because it's mixed. We advise against it, whether it's a Hatch Act violation or not. I don't know what the courts would say. There's no case law in this area,
Okay.
right? So we just try based on activities from the past that are analogous to try to apply it to this whole new world of social media. But social media tends to blur the lines between official and personal in many instances. Okay. So we advise against it in terms of a best practice. Whether in fact it would be a violation or not, I would need to know more, like look at your Facebook page to give you an honest opinion of what I think.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay?
Sorry, could I ask a clarifying question? Did you say that you have a personal page, a campaign page, and then the official page?
Right, so the office has a page
Yep.
that I do not have access to.
Okay,
I have deputies and actually one of my lieutenants here that manage that page.
okay,
But what I do is if there is something community-related and sheriff's office-related, I share that to my personal page, and I don't add to it. I just share to my page.
and the personal page is separate from your campaign page?
Yes.
Am I understanding that?
Yes.
Yeah, but he says he barely uses the campaign page at all.
Oh, okay, so you use your personal page for campaign purposes, so it, is that what you're
No,
saying?
not really.
Yeah.
Oh, no, then you're fine.
No.
Yeah, if it's your
Then you're fine.
personal.
Most of what's on my personal
Yeah.
page are the items that I share from our sheriff's office page.
And I think there would be a difference there between your personal page, which you're using in your personal capacity, maybe even in your, does it have your title and everything on there on your personal page? Your official title?
I don't believe so.
Okay. Yeah, I think that would be treated differently than
Right.
the campaign page. So I think it would be permissible
Yeah.
to share official material to your personal page. That's not your campaign page,
Sure.
if that makes sense.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you so much.
Sure.
All right, so this is getting kind of complicated. So make sure I'm understanding this correctly. So let's say a sheriff's office page shares a post of an incident. What would prohibit a candidate's page or a campaign page from just resharing that information? Because it's a person's ability to just share that. Anyone on the street can share it. So why would a campaign be prohibited from sharing that information?
Go.
Sure. So if the campaign that you're discussing,
Yes,
if that
ma'am.
campaign is for a candidate who was
Yeah.
covered by the Hatch Act?
Yes.
Then the Hatch Act, what Anna is describing is
Yeah.
you'd be sharing official content
Okay,
for campaign purposes.
okay.
But,
But if you're the incumbent, it's okay.
well, no, and the other thing is that it's being put out there publicly.
Yeah, publicly,
Which is what
where-
gets tricky.
Yeah.
It's like if you cut and paste from a news
Yes.
article. And we've had these mixed.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you're asking that question.
Yeah.
Because it's very hard. Another candidate
Mm-hmm.
in the race could be cutting and clipping stuff that's out there publicly.
Yeah,
My concern is having someone, which I think is more what I was hearing over here. If your campaign is going and getting information that's publicly available,
yes.
I don't think that's a Hatch Act violation. Are we on the same page?
I
Thank
think
you.
Yes.
Thank you.
But I would not have someone
Yes.
from your official office feeding
Yes,
content to the campaign.
yes, ma'am. Okay,
But if it's out there publicly,
yeah,
I think it's very hard, whether it's a news article
okay,
or any other type of public content,
okay,
to prevent you from using it.
okay. I have another question. So let's say, hypothetically speaking, that a current Commonwealth attorney does not like the incumbent sheriff. All right?
Commonwealth attorney, okay. Just a hypothetical, right?
Hypothetical. And let's say this Commonwealth Attorney's Office receives federal funding for drug programs. Let's say drug court. And hypothetically speaking, the Commonwealth Attorney has made contributions to the opposition.
So,
And it's, what's that?
so the question is, can a hypothetically speaking
Yes.
Commonwealth attorney
Yes, ma'am.
make, they have a program that receives federal funds.
Yes.
Can that Commonwealth attorney, is
Mm-hmm.
there something in the Hatch Act that prohibits that person from making political contributions to any candidate
Or endorsements.
or endorsements? So assuming the person's covered, let's work with the assumption the person's covered, and they likely are, but.
They also
let's-
work for the federal government is a reservist in the military, and they use that uniform.
The
As well.
military, no, I missed that part.
That's okay. Well, I threw that one in there.
Okay, I missed
in
that
the
part.
hypothetical
I'm
scenario.
I'm going to assume that this Commonwealth attorney is covered by the Hatch Act.
Yes, ma'am, he
You
is.
can, even if you're covered, you can make, it's one of the permitted activities. You can make political contributions.
Okay.
But you said there was something, or endorsements,
Yes,
right?
yes,
The endorsement is the trickier question.
yes.
Commonwealth attorney, elected official? Okay, so Commonwealth attorney's elected official, then the same rule applies. They can, because I was going to say, probably
Okay.
can't use their official title, but because they're elected, even if they're covered, they could, in their official capacity, endorse another candidate.
Okay, all right. Scratch that hypothetical.
Okay.
I've got a Facebook question as well. If there's a particular case or a particular problem with an officer that comes into a campaign, and your opponent zeroes in on a case or, and they try to make it a political issue, is it permissible to come on the official sheriff's office post, and it may look like it's very well a political campaign statement, but I didn't make it the campaign. I didn't bring it into the political arena. They're trying to capitalize on something that's happened in the courts or something, and I literally just came and put the facts out versus this stuff over here that somebody running is trying to maliciously take. It could very well easily look like it's a campaign post, but if I'm not the one that's bringing it into the political arena, can I set the record straight using factual information, stuff that the way it did actually transpire in the court, and use the official page to do that?
Yeah. So that's a question that comes up a lot during presidential elections, where you have an incumbent and then you have the opponent, often, right, making misstatements or whatever
I mean,
about
I
the record
understand
of
that
the
having
incumbent.
having two different pages.
Yeah.
I have all that, but
Sure.
there's been about 5 times in the last 2 election cycles that I've been through where I have come up on the sheriff's office page and been like, here's the facts.
Sure. So what we advise in those instances, and I'm going back because this happens very often with presidential elections, the incumbent, the office of the incumbent is still an operating office, and it gets to continue talking about policy, its decision-making, and defend its policies.
Okay.
So as long as your response is measured and official and not directly, targeting, it may be, and I get your point, but as long as your content remains official and doesn't now look like you're directly saying, and candidate so-and-so said X, and here's why they're wrong, I would advise you not to use official channels for that. But if you know what they're saying is wrong, and for your office's purposes, you need to set the record straight, by all means, set the record straight. Just don't mention the election.
Okay, thank you.
Okay? Then very quickly, because I think I've got like 2 minutes left.
I think there's another
This is,
question, Ann.
I'm sorry?
There's another question.
Sure.
I'll make it fast.
Oh, yeah, and this is, we have 2 slides
So
left.
the person's not the elected official, but a lieutenant, let's just say, in the office. So uniform question, it is a partisan election, but there is no federal funding attached. Yes, uniform, no uniform.
So no federal funding.
Let's just say no for the
And the
purposes of this.
lieutenant wants to use a uniform?
Correct.
Not a Hatch Act issue, or could be a local issue with the use of uniform, but if there's
Well,
no money.
Let's say her sheriff's okay with it, let's say then.
I'm sorry?
Say it again, sorry.
Let's say the sheriff's okay with it.
The sheriff's okay with it.
Okay. Yeah, I'm confused.
Yeah, so if there's no federal money at the federal agencies, so there would be no duties in connection with federally
Yeah,
funded
there's-
programs.
But it is a partisan election. I'll make sure I put that in there.
Doesn't matter.
That's fine.
That doesn't matter.
Yeah.
If there's no federal money, then the restrictions on use of uniform and title do not apply.
Okay, thank you.
Okay? Very quickly, if there's a violation and it warrants disciplinary action, we try to resolve the majority of our state and local cases. We get good compliance. People take down the photograph if it's inappropriate because people are in uniform. We try to settle most of our state and local cases. But if there's a case that's serious, we can prove the case, we go seek disciplinary action before the Merit Systems Protection Board, okay? And that's the board that decides. It's a regular case. We put on our case, the subject defends. If the board finds that there is a violation and that it warrants removal, because that's the only penalty for state and local subjects, what happens next is that the Merit Systems Protection Board notifies the employer and indicates the finding, says the finding, there's a violation, it warrants removal. The agency has 30 days to remove the individual. If the agency does not, then the agency forfeits federal money, federal grants equivalent to 2 years' salary for the individual. So if the individual makes $80,000, the agency forfeits $160 if they choose not to remove the individual. When it comes to a sheriff or someone in an elected position, it's a lot trickier because the chances are the elected official's not going to step down from office, right? There's no one there to remove them. So it hasn't happened yet, thankfully, but our position would be that we would then go back to the board and it would be a forfeiture issue. Unless the governor, for example, has the authority to remove an elected official. It would just be a forfeiture that kicks in these cases. This is our contact information. I know a lot of you are familiar with our hotline. We've also got an inbox. People email us all the time. And our website, we have a new video. Actually, Kelly is the star of the video. It's about a 5-minute video on a lot of the issues that we just discussed. So if you want a refresher, you want to see some of the content on our website, it's in a video. And then we also have FAQs, but please feel free to call our office. We're really here to help you all out. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. I will tell you this is probably the 5th time I've heard you present, and it always leaves more questions because everybody has situations. So I'll tell you, these slides are in your app, and that slide right there is very important. They're very responsive. I've reached out to them on a number of occasions, and they're quick to get back to me to answer those questions, and I know they're happy to do so. They're also going to stick around. We're going to take a break now for 15 minutes. They'll be here to answer any other questions you have, and then we'll come back in 15 minutes, so thank you.